The most dangerous man is not the one everyone fears, but the one no one ever treated like a human being. Victor Moretti had never been spoken to like an ordinary man. In his world, every voice that reached him carried weight, calculation, or fear. Respect was not something given freely. It was extracted through presence, reputation, and the quiet understanding that hesitation could be fatal in a business built on control. He was a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, known across Boston's underground circles as someone who did not need to raise his voice to change the temperature of a room. Every interaction around him followed a predictable pattern. People lowered their eyes. They shortened their sentences. They chose words carefully, as if speaking too freely might tilt an invisible scale. Even those who worked closest to him maintained a respectful distance, treating him less like a person and more like a fixed point of authority. That was the structure he had always lived within, and over time, it had become the only language he recognized from others. Yet somewhere outside that structure, a woman named Sophie Bennett began to move through his world without acknowledging any of it. She was a white American woman in her late 20s, not someone who belonged to the environment he occupied, not someone who should have crossed paths with him under normal circumstances. But what made her presence notable was not her appearance or her background. It was the absence of fear in her behavior. The first time she spoke to him, there was no hesitation in her voice, no careful adjustment of tone, no visible awareness of the hierarchy that shaped every other interaction around him. She simply spoke as if he were a person standing in front of her, rather than a force that defined the space around him. It did not fit anything Victor Moretti understood about how people were supposed to behave in his presence. For a man whose life had been built on controlled environments and predictable reactions, that moment created a disruption that was not loud, but precise. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he observed her the way he observed most things that did not align with expectation. Sophie did not flinch under his attention. She did not try to fill silence with nervous words, nor did she attempt to adjust herself to match the unspoken rules everyone else seemed to instinctively follow. She simply remained consistent, treating the interaction as if there was nothing unusual about it at all. That consistency was what unsettled him. Not because it challenged his authority, but because it bypassed it entirely. In every system he understood, behavior was shaped by awareness of consequence. People adapted to power, resisted it, or exploited it. But Sophie Bennett did none of these things. She did not react to him as a symbol of danger or status. She reacted as if he were simply present. The idea should have been insignificant, yet it lingered longer than it should have. Over the following days, Victor found himself revisiting that first encounter not because of anything she had done, but because of what she had not done. She had not treated him as a threat. She had not treated him as a myth. She had treated him as if he was still part of the same category as everyone else. And for a man who had built his identity on being separated from that category, the experience created a subtle fracture in perception that he could not immediately resolve. It was not admiration. It was not irritation. It was something closer to recognition of a gap in his understanding of how people were shaped by presence, power, and expectation. Sophie Bennett had not challenged him directly. She had not needed to. And in doing so, she had introduced something into his world that no amount of control had prepared him for: the possibility of being seen without being defined by fear. What Victor Moretti did not anticipate after that first unsettling encounter with Sophie Bennett was that a single deviation in human behavior could begin to reshape the way he interpreted everything around him, not through force or confrontation, but through repetition and silence that slowly refused to conform to his established understanding of people. He remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a world where respect was structured, hierarchy was absolute, and emotional distance was not only expected but necessary for control. Yet Sophie Bennett continued to exist inside that structure without acknowledging it in the way everyone else did. She remained a white American woman in her late 20s, moving through environments connected to his influence without adjusting her behavior to match the unspoken rules that governed them. She did not challenge those rules directly. She simply behaved as if they did not apply to her at all. At first, Victor attempted to categorize her behavior within familiar frameworks. He considered ignorance, but quickly dismissed it because her awareness of context was too precise to be accidental. He considered strategy, but found no evidence of manipulation or leverage in her actions. She did not gain anything from interacting with him in the way she did, nor did she attempt to extract information, influence, or protection. This absence of transactional intent created a gap in his reasoning that he could not immediately close. In his environment, every interaction carried measurable purpose. Sophie Bennett introduced something that did not. Over the following days, he began to notice that her presence in his sphere of awareness was not limited to direct encounters. It extended into indirect moments where reports, brief sightings, and coincidental overlaps placed her within proximity of his world without any indication that she was seeking it. Yet even in those moments, her behavior remained consistent. She did not react to the environment as if it belonged to someone specific. She moved through it as if it belonged to no one in particular. That distinction became increasingly difficult for him to ignore. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her routine without visible change. She worked, interacted with others, and moved through the city without altering her behavior in response to what would normally be perceived as intimidation or status pressure. To her, Victor Moretti was still simply a person she had encountered, not a force she needed to calibrate herself against. This consistency became the most destabilizing factor for Victor. Not because she resisted him, but because she did not acknowledge the need to resist him at all. One afternoon, a brief, indirect intersection occurred again in a shared environment connected loosely to his operations. Victor observed from a distance without revealing presence, noting how others adjusted their behavior around her simply by instinct, while she remained unchanged in posture and expression. She did not seek attention, nor did she avoid it. She simply existed within it without transformation. For Victor, this created a contradiction that his internal logic struggled to resolve. People were supposed to adapt to power even unconsciously. Yet Sophie Bennett did not appear to register power as something that required adaptation. The more he observed, the more he realized that his initial interpretation of her behavior as anomaly was incomplete. It was not that she failed to recognize his authority. It was that she did not appear to define human interaction through authority at all. This realization did not produce immediate emotional response, but it introduced a structural uncertainty into his understanding of himself within social space. If authority was no longer universally acknowledged in the way he assumed, then the foundation of his interactions was not absolute but conditional. And Sophie, without intention or effort, had become the only variable that demonstrated this possibility without explanation. She had not changed his world. She had simply continued to exist within it, as if it were already different. What was beginning to emerge between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett was no longer a simple pattern of observation and anomaly, but a slow restructuring of perception itself, where each encounter, however brief or indirect, reinforced a shifting imbalance in how reality was being interpreted from both sides without either of them consciously acknowledging the full scope of it. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a controlled environment built on hierarchy, consequence, and silent authority, where every social interaction was traditionally filtered through awareness of power dynamics. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to move through the same connected urban spaces without altering her behavior in response to the invisible frameworks that governed everyone else around him. What made the situation increasingly complex for Victor was not that Sophie resisted his authority, but that she appeared entirely unaware of it as a defining factor in interaction. In his experience, ignorance would normally produce hesitation or caution once exposure occurred, but Sophie demonstrated neither escalation nor retreat. Instead, she maintained a level of conversational and behavioral normality that removed hierarchy from the interaction entirely, as if it was not a relevant dimension of human exchange. This created a form of cognitive dissonance within Victor's structured understanding of social behavior. He began to revisit each interaction, not for what was said, but for what was absent. There was no performance of submission, no subtle attempt to gain favor, no visible adjustment in tone or posture when his identity became known. Even in environments where others instinctively shifted their behavior upon recognizing his presence, Sophie's responses remained unchanged. She acknowledged him as a person in space rather than a force in structure. That distinction continued to echo in his analysis longer than any single conversation should have allowed. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her life without deliberate awareness of the effect she was having on his interpretive framework. She moved through her daily routines, worked and interacted with others in a consistent manner that did not fluctuate based on proximity to status or implied authority. However, subtle changes began to appear in the way her environment responded to her presence, not through her own intention, but through the behavior of others who adjusted unconsciously to the lack of intimidation she projected. People who normally deferred in silence around Victor's world did not find the same reference point in her behavior, and this absence of expected reaction created minor but noticeable disruptions in social rhythm. Victor observed these patterns from a distance, noting not only how Sophie behaved, but how others failed to recalibrate her into their usual hierarchy-based responses. It was in this discrepancy that he began to recognize a deeper implication. If human behavior around power was largely conditioned and Sophie disrupted that conditioning simply by existing without acknowledgement of it, then the structure he had always relied on was not absolute but dependent on mutual reinforcement. This realization did not come as an emotional reaction but as a logical fracture in his long-held assumptions. He did not yet question his authority, but he began to question the universality of its recognition. At the same time, Sophie experienced no conscious awareness of this shift. To her, interactions remained ordinary, defined by immediate context rather than underlying structure. Yet her consistency became the very mechanism through which that structure was revealed. Each unchanged response acted as a mirror, reflecting not change in her, but instability in the system around her. Victor found himself returning to those moments mentally, not because they challenged him directly, but because they failed to resolve into any familiar category of understanding. In his world, every behavior had a place within hierarchy, intent, or strategy. Sophie Bennett existed outside those categories without effort or explanation. And in that absence of classification, something unfamiliar began to form within his perception. Not attraction, not resistance, but the recognition that human interaction might exist in a state he had never previously considered, where authority was not responded to, but simply not defined at all. By the time the dynamic between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett entered its next stage of development, the pattern that had once been defined by simple inconsistency had evolved into a stable psychological structure of mutual influence, where neither direct contact nor explicit intention was required for the shift in perception to continue progressing on both sides. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a carefully controlled environment shaped by hierarchy, silence, and authority, where most human behavior could be predicted through understanding of fear, ambition, or dependence. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing her life within the same urban ecosystem, without adjusting her behavior to accommodate the implicit rules that govern Victor's world. What made this phase different from previous interactions was not the presence of new events, but the accumulation of interpretive tension within Victor's awareness. He no longer analyzed Sophie as a single anomaly within his environment. Instead, she had become a consistent reference point that disrupted the reliability of his behavioral assumptions. Every time he expected her response to align with established patterns of deference or strategic adjustment, she failed to conform to either category. This absence of expected reaction forced him into a continuous state of reevaluation, where interpretation itself became more active than observation. Sophie, on the other hand, remained unaware of the full scope of this internal shift. She continued to interact with him in a manner that remained unchanged in tone, posture, and emotional calibration. She did not display awareness of hierarchy as a governing principle in their exchanges, nor did she alter her behavior in response to his reputation or presence. To her, Victor remained simply a person occupying space within the same reality, not a structural force that required adjustment or adaptation. This cognitive separation between their interpretations of the same interaction created an increasingly complex psychological divergence. Victor began to notice that his understanding of authority, which had always functioned as a universal constant in his world, was no longer producing consistent outcomes when applied to Sophie's behavior. In controlled environments where others instinctively recalibrated their responses based on his presence, Sophie's lack of recalibration highlighted the conditional nature of those responses in others. This realization did not manifest as emotional instability, but as analytical disruption. It introduced the possibility that authority itself was not an inherent property, but a socially reinforced construct that depended on collective acknowledgement to maintain its function. Meanwhile, Sophie experienced no internal shift that corresponded to Victor's growing interpretive instability. Her decisions remained guided by immediate context rather than perceived hierarchy, and her consistency continued to operate without strategic adaptation. However, the effect of that consistency became more pronounced over time within the environment surrounding Victor. Individuals who normally adjusted their behavior in response to his presence appeared less predictable when Sophie was nearby, not because she influenced them directly, but because her absence of reaction disrupted the expected social rhythm that reinforced Victor's established structure. Victor observed these variations with increasing focus, not because they threatened his position, but because they revealed a dependency he had not previously acknowledged. The authority he embodied functioned not in isolation, but through continuous reinforcement by the behavior of others. Sophie's presence did not challenge that authority directly, but it exposed the conditions under which it operated. As this understanding developed, Victor found himself returning mentally to their interactions with greater frequency, not seeking contradiction, but attempting to locate classification. Yet Sophie continued to resist classification entirely. She did not represent opposition, compliance, or manipulation. She existed outside the interpretive boundaries he had always used to define human behavior. And within that space of unresolved categorization, Victor began to experience a subtle but persistent shift in perception, where the absence of fear in another person became more structurally significant than the presence of control in himself. By the time the next stage of psychological convergence between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett began to stabilize into a recognizable internal pattern, the nature of their connection had moved beyond simple observation and entered a phase where interpretation itself had become the primary mechanism shaping Victor's understanding of both Sophie and, increasingly, his own position within the social structures he had always assumed to be fixed. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a highly controlled environment defined by hierarchy, silence, and implicit authority, where human behavior was traditionally categorized through predictable responses to power, fear, or calculated interest. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to move through the same interconnected urban environments without altering her behavior in response to Victor's presence or the implicit weight his identity carried within those spaces. At this stage, what had once been interpreted as anomaly had become something closer to a reference point within Victor's cognitive framework. He no longer evaluated Sophie's behavior as isolated deviation, but as a consistent structural exception that exposed the conditional nature of his expectations regarding human response to authority. Each interaction, whether direct or indirectly observed, reinforced the same pattern. Sophie did not adjust herself in relation to him. She did not increase caution, reduce expression, or modify tone based on perceived hierarchy. Instead, she maintained a level of behavioral neutrality that effectively removed the category of authority from the interaction entirely. This absence of recalibration created a growing analytical pressure within Victor's perception, not because it threatened his position, but because it disrupted the predictive reliability of his interpretive model. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her daily life without any conscious awareness of the broader structural implications of her behavior. She remained consistent in tone, posture, and interpersonal engagement, interacting with others and with Victor in a manner that was defined by immediacy rather than hierarchy. To her, interactions were shaped by context and presence, not by underlying systems of power that others appeared to instinctively acknowledge. However, this consistency began to produce secondary effects within the environment she passed through. Individuals who normally adjusted their behavior in response to Victor's presence exhibited slight deviations when Sophie was nearby, not because she directly influenced them, but because her lack of reaction disrupted the expected social synchronization that reinforced hierarchical stability. Victor observed these shifts with increasing analytical attention. What he began to recognize was that authority, as he had always understood it, functioned not as an absolute condition, but as a continuously reinforced agreement among those who recognized it. Sophie's behavior did not directly challenge this structure, yet it revealed its dependency on collective acknowledgement. Without explicit intention, she created conditions under which that acknowledgement became less uniform. As this realization deepened, Victor found himself revisiting earlier encounters with Sophie, not in search of emotional meaning, but in search of structural clarity. Each memory reinforced the same unresolved pattern. She had never behaved as though his authority required recognition. This did not place her in opposition to him, nor did it position her as someone attempting to undermine his influence. Instead, she existed entirely outside the interpretive necessity of that framework. For Victor, this was more destabilizing than resistance would have been, because resistance still confirmed the existence of the structure being resisted. Sophie did not confirm it at all. At the same time, Victor's internal processing began to shift subtly from external analysis toward self-referential questioning. If authority required recognition to function, and Sophie did not provide that recognition, then the stability of his perceived environment was more conditional than absolute. This line of reasoning did not produce immediate emotional reaction, but it introduced a recursive uncertainty into his understanding of control. Sophie's continued presence within his awareness therefore became less about her actions and more about what her actions revealed regarding the limits of his interpretive system. She remained unchanged, unadjusted, and unresponsive to hierarchy, yet her very consistency was now altering the way Victor understood the structure of human interaction itself. And within that silent recalibration, the boundary between observer and observed began to blur further, not through communication or conflict, but through the gradual erosion of assumptions that had once defined the stability of his world. By the time the final stage of psychological transformation between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett began to settle into a stable internal structure, the nature of their connection had fully shifted from external observation into a sustained cognitive presence within Victor's interpretive framework, where Sophie was no longer simply a person moving through his environment, but had become a constant reference point through which he unknowingly reassessed the meaning of authority, interaction, and human response itself. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a controlled world built on hierarchy, silence, and the assumed universality of power as a defining factor in human behavior. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to exist within the same urban environment, without altering her behavior in response to the weight of that structure, maintaining the same calm consistency that had first disrupted Victor's understanding of social predictability. At this stage, the dynamic between them had moved beyond the earlier phase of anomaly detection and interpretive tension. It had become a sustained psychological feedback loop, where each of Sophie's unchanging responses reinforced Victor's ongoing reassessment of his own assumptions about control. What Victor began to recognize with increasing clarity was that Sophie did not interact with authority as a variable at all. She did not resist it, acknowledge it, or adjust herself in relation to it. Instead, she operated in a behavioral framework where authority simply did not function as a relevant category for interaction. This realization created a structural dissonance within Victor's internal model of human behavior. In his experience, authority existed not only through enforcement but through recognition, a continuous cycle of acknowledgement that reinforced its presence in every interaction. Sophie's behavior disrupted that cycle without direct opposition. She did not challenge him, yet she also did not validate the framework through which he understood himself. This absence of validation became more significant over time than any form of resistance would have been. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her daily life without any indication that her behavior carried broader implications within Victor's interpretive system. She moved through conversations, environments, and routine interactions with the same consistency she had always maintained, responding to people based on immediate context rather than perceived hierarchy. However, within Victor's sphere of observation, her presence continued to produce secondary effects in the behavior of others. Individuals who typically adjusted themselves in response to Victor's authority demonstrated subtle inconsistencies when Sophie was present, not because she influenced them directly, but because her lack of reaction disrupted the expected social calibration that reinforced hierarchical behavior patterns. Victor observed these deviations with increasing analytical precision. He began to understand that what he had always interpreted as authority was not an absolute condition, but a collectively maintained structure dependent on mutual recognition. Sophie's behavior did not dismantle that structure, but it exposed its dependency on shared acknowledgement for stability. This exposure introduced a level of uncertainty into Victor's perception that could not be resolved through control or observation alone. As this understanding developed, Victor found himself shifting from external analysis of Sophie's behavior toward internal reflection on the foundations of his own identity within the system he had always inhabited. If authority required continuous reinforcement to exist, and if Sophie consistently withheld that reinforcement without intention, then the stability of his perceived environment was not inherent but conditional. This realization did not manifest as emotional collapse or reaction, but as a slow structural recalibration within his thinking process. Sophie had not changed her behavior, yet her unchanging presence had altered the way Victor interpreted every interaction surrounding her. She remained unchanged, unmodified, and unaffected by the framework that defined everyone else in his world, and in doing so, she became the only consistent variable capable of revealing the instability hidden beneath assumed order. And within that final recognition, Victor Moretti no longer viewed Sophie Bennett as an exception within his environment, but as the quiet catalyst that had exposed the fragile boundary between power as it is performed and power as it is perceived. By the time the next phase of psychological convergence between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett began to stabilize into its most defined structure yet, the dynamic between them had moved beyond interpretation of behavior and into the formation of an internalized presence, where Sophie was no longer merely an external anomaly within Victor's environment, but had become a continuous cognitive reference point shaping the way he processed authority, interaction, and identity itself. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a tightly controlled system built on hierarchy, silence, and the assumption that human behavior could be understood through predictable responses to power and consequence. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to move through the same urban environments without any visible adjustment to the implicit structure that governed Victor's world. At this stage, the most significant transformation was not in their external interactions, but in Victor's internal processing of Sophie's consistency. He no longer evaluated her behavior as deviation from a norm. Instead, she had become the reference point against which the stability of that norm itself was being measured. Each unaltered interaction reinforced a recursive question within his thinking: whether authority was truly an inherent condition of his environment, or whether it only existed through collective acknowledgement that Sophie, intentionally or not, consistently withheld. Sophie's behavior remained unchanged. She continued to engage with people, spaces, and conversations without recalibration based on perceived hierarchy. Her responses were immediate, contextual, and unfiltered by the structural awareness that governed everyone else in Victor's sphere. Yet within his observational framework, this consistency had begun to produce a cumulative effect that extended beyond individual encounters. The behavior of others around her continued to show minor deviations when compared to standard patterns of deference, adjustment, and anticipation that typically defined Victor's presence. These deviations were not large enough to signal disruption, but they were consistent enough to indicate that the reinforcing loop of authority was being subtly destabilized in her proximity. Victor observed these patterns with increasing analytical focus. What he began to understand was that authority was not a static condition embedded in his identity, but a dynamic structure sustained through continuous behavioral confirmation from others. Sophie's lack of participation in that confirmation process did not directly challenge authority, but it exposed its dependency on collective behavioral alignment. This realization did not produce emotional reaction, but it created a structural shift in his internal logic. The framework he had always relied on to interpret human interaction began to reveal conditional boundaries that had previously been invisible. Meanwhile, Sophie remained unaware of this evolving interpretive system surrounding her. She did not perceive her behavior as significant within any broader structure, nor did she adjust herself in response to the subtle shifts occurring in Victor's environment. To her, interactions remained grounded in immediate context rather than layered hierarchy. However, her consistency continued to function as a stabilizing exception within Victor's observational field, a constant that revealed variability in everything around it. Over time, Victor found himself moving away from external analysis and into internal reflection, not because Sophie had changed, but because her unchanging presence had altered the reliability of his assumptions. He began to recognize that his understanding of authority had always depended on uninterrupted recognition, and that without that recognition, even selectively absent in a single consistent case, the perception of control could not be treated as absolute. Sophie Bennett did not act as an antagonist to his world, nor did she attempt to redefine it. Instead, she existed within it as a parallel logic that refused alignment with its foundational assumptions. And within that refusal, Victor Moretti encountered a realization that extended beyond her behavior alone, that the systems he had always trusted to define human interaction were not universal laws, but maintained agreements, and Sophie, without ever intending to, had become the only person who lived within his world without agreeing to its language. By the time the final stage of psychological convergence between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett reached its most stable form, the nature of their connection had fully transitioned from external observation into internalized structural awareness, where Sophie was no longer simply a person moving through Victor's environment but had become a continuous interpretive presence shaping the way he understood authority, identity, and the fragile mechanisms that sustained both. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a world defined by hierarchy, silence, and controlled perception, where human behavior had always been interpreted through predictable responses to power, consequence, and fear. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to exist within the same urban environment, without any visible adjustment to the structural expectations that governed Victor's world. At this stage, what had once been an anomaly had evolved into a foundational disruption within Victor's cognitive framework. He no longer viewed Sophie as an exception to the rules of behavior he understood. Instead, she had become the reference point that exposed the conditional nature of those rules themselves. Every interaction, whether direct or indirectly observed, reinforced a consistent pattern. Sophie did not engage with authority as a functional category of human interaction. She neither resisted it nor acknowledged it. She simply operated outside of it as a relevant interpretive factor. This absence of recognition created a recursive instability in Victor's understanding of his own position within the system he had always believed to be absolute. Authority, as he had always understood it, required continuous validation through collective behavioral alignment. Without that alignment, its presence became interpretive rather than intrinsic. Sophie's behavior did not dismantle authority, but it revealed its dependency on acknowledgement, a dependency that had previously been invisible within his operational assumptions. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her life without any awareness of the structural implications surrounding her. She remained consistent in tone, behavior, and interaction, engaging with people and environments based solely on immediate context, rather than hierarchical positioning. However, within Victor's sphere of observation, her consistency had begun to generate measurable effects in the behavior of others. Individuals who typically adjusted themselves in response to his presence displayed subtle inconsistencies when Sophie was nearby, not because she influenced them directly, but because her lack of behavioral calibration disrupted the expected rhythm of deference that reinforced systemic stability. Victor observed these patterns with increasing analytical depth. What he began to recognize was that authority did not exist as an isolated property of the individual, but as a continuously reinforced construct dependent on shared recognition. Sophie's presence did not oppose this construct, but her refusal to participate in it exposed its conditional architecture. This realization did not manifest as emotional disruption, but as structural recalibration within his interpretive model of reality. As this understanding deepened, Victor found himself shifting from external analysis of Sophie's behavior toward internal reflection on the foundations of his own identity within that system. If authority required recognition to maintain coherence, and Sophie consistently withheld that recognition without intention or awareness, then the stability of his perceived environment was not absolute but dependent on uninterrupted consensus. This introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be resolved through control, presence, or reputation alone. Sophie Bennett did not redefine his world through opposition. She redefined it through indifference to its defining principle. And within that indifference, Victor Moretti encountered the final realization that the structure he had always inhabited was not a universal law of human behavior, but a maintained agreement sustained only as long as everyone, without exception, continued to believe in its necessity. By the time the final phase of psychological convergence between Victor Moretti and Sophie Bennett reached its definitive stabilization point, The entire structure of their connection had transformed into something that no longer depended on physical proximity, communication, or even intentional interaction, but instead existed as a sustained cognitive overlap, where perception itself had become the primary medium of influence between them. Victor remained a white Italian-American man in his late 30s, operating within a highly controlled environment defined by hierarchy, silence, and the long-standing assumption that authority is maintained through collective recognition and behavioral alignment. Sophie Bennett remained a white American woman in her late 20s, continuing to live within the same urban environment without altering her behavior in response to the invisible structural expectations that govern Victor's world. At this stage, the distinction between observation and participation had effectively dissolved within Victor's internal framework. Sophie was no longer processed as an external anomaly, or even as a consistent exception to behavioral expectations. Instead, she had become the reference point through which Victor evaluated the conditional nature of every assumption he had ever made about authority, control, and human response. Every previous interpretation he had held regarding hierarchy had been built on the premise that recognition was universal and automatic within any structured system of power. Sophie's continued refusal to acknowledge that premise without resistance or confrontation had fundamentally destabilized that assumption. She did not reject authority, nor did she challenge it. She simply existed as if it were not a defining variable in human interaction. This created a final structural contradiction within Victor's perception. Authority remained operational within his world, yet it was no longer absolute in its recognition. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her life without awareness of the interpretive framework forming around her presence. She remained consistent in her behavior, engaging with others based on immediate context rather than perceived hierarchy or implied power structures. However, within Victor's observational field, her consistency had long since ceased to be neutral. It functioned as a stabilizing deviation that exposed the dependency of his entire system on continuous acknowledgement from those within it. Individuals who normally adjusted their behavior in response to Victor's presence still did so, but the presence of Sophie within overlapping environments revealed that this adjustment was not intrinsic but conditioned. When she was present, the uniformity of that conditioning became visibly less absolute, not through disruption she caused, but through the contrast her behavior introduced. Victor observed this not as a threat, but as a final clarification of structural dependency that had previously been obscured by consistency of response. At this stage, his internal interpretation of Sophie shifted one final time. She was no longer an exception, no longer an anomaly, and no longer a variable requiring classification. She had become the mechanism through which classification itself was revealed to be conditional. The implication of this realization extended beyond Sophie as an individual. It reached into Victor's understanding of himself, his role, and the nature of authority as he had always defined it. If authority required recognition to exist in practice, and if recognition could be withheld without resistance or consequence, then authority was not an inherent force but a maintained agreement sustained through uninterrupted belief. Sophie Bennett had never attempted to change that agreement. She had simply never participated in it. And in that absence of participation, Victor Moretti was forced to confront the final and irreversible conclusion that the structure he had always inhabited was not the foundation of human behavior, but a shared illusion that remained stable only as long as no one stood within it without acknowledging its necessity.